Thank you very much for coming here. I'm very, very excited and pleased, and especially this introduction to this birthplace of engineering, but also the innovation and the challenges. Just put this glass away, actually, and basically having the opportunity to have those discussions with you. I don't necessarily want to talk for 55 minutes because I think it's much more opening up the interactive questions and answers and where to go and how do we take this stuff forward. And that's really valuable in a two-way street. And so really I welcome everybody, ask questions, clarification as we're going, but then when we come back after break, let's really look at, okay, what do we have to do, why we have to do it, where the impediments are, and what are the sort of actions at your local level, but also globally that we can take. Bit of background about me. You see, like Christopher said, I mean, that doesn't matter how you think of me, I just think of myself an innocent bystander down under. That's from Australia, and of course it's down in the soil, and they're all friends, they're my fungi, they're my friends. So what's all this stuff? And I don't have quite the notoriety that Christopher might suggest. But look, we've been working, and I've been a scientist for sort of 60 years, 55, 60 years working, and we've been basically at this game for a long time. It was 1972, we had the Stockholm Earth Summit, and all the data was there, wasn't it? It was basically limits to growth, population pressures, land degradation, the UNCCD, Commission for Combating Desertification, for example, and of course we had climate change, right? And so for 50 years, over 50 years, we've had this knowledge, awareness, warnings, and somehow or other we're still having warnings. It's getting closer and closer to midnight, the clock gets set back because we can't be too close to it. And so really, it's really sort of a question of what's gone wrong. Why is it that we aren't addressing what is really a very, very serious imperative? And it's not just the science, it's not the practice, but also where is it in our actual management, our sociology, our politics, where these impediments exist. And really it's back to us now, like the engineers, those innovators, those extroverts or exceptional people, to say, okay, how do we actually catalyze a change? What has to happen? Because the bottom line, and this is really tragic, but it was defined, Hadley Center, 2005, it's not just climate change, it's not just CO2, it's not just incremental warming, it's actually dangerous hydrological climate extremes that are actually accelerating and will impact the climate, but not just the climate, it will impact communities and biosystems and the very economies and foundations of society. There'll be 9 billion of us by 2030 on this planet, and again, the same situation, where's the food, the water, the habitat, but most of all, the biosystems and the social stability to sustain them. The Arab Spring 2008 showed us there are 7 missed meals between social stability and chaos. And of course we saw from Syria's experience, the world's cradle, or Western world's cradle of agriculture, food production, urbanization. You see, the Fertile Crescent is now a desert, and we've basically got refugees coming into Europe. And again, were we able to handle that? Were we able to accommodate them amongst 200 million people in Europe? Or was this issue of 7 missed meals and chaos? Okay, so I think we all know here are these imperatives that we're facing, but really today, and what we as Regenerate Earth present, is in a sense good news, right? This is really powerful good news, because there are solutions. In fact, there is one fundamental, simple solution to all of this. It's practical, it's doable, it's highly profitable, it's attainable, and basically that's recognizing that nature created these biosystems that we depend on, that we evolved on, that are critical to our future, and just as nature evolved them, if we are willing to understand, regenerate them, we've got the capacity, again, to solve these problems we've got. So the bottom line today is, while we've got really serious things to address, there are solutions. They are in nature, and of course we know enough about nature that we say, yes, it's actually the soil. They all come round to the soil, because it's the soil that gives us the basis of life, hydrology, cooling, biosystems, resilience, the whole things that or values we depend on. And again, how do we then regenerate soils as part of that story? So that's the big picture. Yes, we're facing crises, but yes, there are solutions, but what we haven't got is time. As we said, 2030, we've got perhaps 10 years, and unless we put these things in play, things are going to get serious, because these dangerous hydrological extremes, whether they're cyclones, floods, erosion, droughts, desertification, wildfires, they will be collapsing and impacting not just arid areas, they'll be hitting us everywhere. So really, let's start at the beginning. I mean, as you said, 72, Stockholm, but also in terms of climate change, we can start basically with our scientific understanding from Charles Keeling. And thank you very much, Christopher. These are wonderful Technicolors. And of course, this is Charles Keeling, and this is CO2 over time. And of course, Charles showed us, CO2 was going up. It was 320, just say, when he started in 1960, when he got the first data, and the CO2 is going up. And of course, he showed us as well, and in a sense, in that he showed us all the solutions that we need. He showed that that was, of course, going up seasonally, so that basically, particularly in the northern hemisphere, in winter, autumn, we had excess emissions. Summer, spring, we had some excess drawdown. So you had this sawtooth. But the bottom line, that CO2 was going up. And we then, of course, sat down and said, we have a problem. We've got a CO2 pollution problem. You see? And we define the problem as CO2. And see, that's where, in a sense, we made a cardinal mistake. Because CO2 is actually a symptom. Okay? CO2 is the building block of life, the building block of soils, of vegetation, of biosystems, actually the mineral, a lot of our planets, a lot of the planet, a lot of the land, the chalk, the carbonates, the limestones, the corals, etc.
And humans.
And life, humans. Yeah, okay. So basically it's a building block. But we then classed it, no, we have a problem, it's pollution, and then the whole focus was, how do we eliminate CO2 emissions? How do we eliminate CO2 emissions? But because we're humans, we'll just eliminate our emissions. And there's about, good pens, tight lids, good. But there's about 8 billion tonnes of carbon per annum that are emitted, of course, as part of this sequence from our use of fossil fuels on the planet each year. And so the issue was, yes, we've got CO2 going up, and yes, we humans are emitting fossil fuel carbon, so we have to draw down that fossil fuel carbon. And so we've spent 50 years basically saying, right, we've got this Faustian bargain between eliminating CO2, but then we have to actually shut down the use of energy, the use of fossil fuels. Now, of course, we have to make this right clear from the beginning. No one's saying we rampantly exploit fossil fuels. We've got to have energy efficiencies. We've got to have alternative energies, solar, wind, all the efficiencies, bioenergy. But we've set ourselves this very, very simplistic limit to the problem. But what we didn't take notice of, the fact that in nature, there's basically 130 billion tonnes of carbon every year that is emitted, and there's 120 billion tonnes of carbon per annum that is drawn back down again from photosynthesis. and this is, in a sense, green plant growth. And basically, there's a 250 billion tonnes flux of carbon every year. And the fossil fuel component of this, obviously, very simply, is 4%, isn't it? Okay, and we sort of said we're responsible, 4%, and we've got this Faustian bargain, but we can't stop it because we're going to crash economies and societies. But we said the rest of it is actually not our problem, that belongs to Mother Nature. Okay, the rest of that dynamic, that flux, is Mother Nature's problem. And of course, it's time for Mother Nature to stand up and say, okay, kids, we'll take charge of it. And this is what Regenerate Earth is all about. Because it's in this 250 billion tonne flux that we can actually solve the problem very, very simply. Okay? Because basically we can reduce emissions. Nobody's ever told you, do you? Every year there's 350 million hectares of forest that burn, and in burning 30 to 200 tonnes of carbon per hectare emitted in the atmosphere. You do the sums, that's equivalent to our fossil fuel use. Okay, so who's in charge of how much forests burn? Who has agency in doing that? We do. Okay, and so it goes, whether it's landfills or whether it's, like basically other sources of emissions that we have. We can actually manage a significant part of this 130 billion tonnes of emission, and we can actually reduce that. But just as potentially important, we can go on the other side of the curve and we can say here's 120 billion tonnes of photosynthesis. The first point to mention about that, that's coming from about 50% of the residual green on this planet. 10,000 years ago, it would have been double that. We weren't around measuring, but basically we have created, basically degraded and created deserts and wasteland over some 5 billion hectares on the planet, which is roughly 40% of its land area. And of course we've compromised the productivity of a lot of the residual biosystems. So the question is, can we raise this 120 billion tonnes significantly? And of course, yes, we can. And that's through wonderful things like agroforestry, regeneration, grazing management, managing blue carbon in basically mangroves and seagrasses. So again, there's a whole lot of wonderfully cheap, safe initiatives that we can basically get into to increase that photosynthetic drawdown. The bottom line, though, is in a sense, again, the mathematics. I've drawn the graph a little bit bigger, of course, but the mathematic is, we basically are every year emitting about 10 billion tonnes of carbon in excess of drawdown now, and that's, of course, why CO2 has gone up. And to get to zero emissions, obviously, we've got to draw down an extra 10 billion tonnes of carbon. Got to do better than that, of course. We've got to go to negative net emissions because, hey, we want this thing to go down. So basically, let's do another 10 billion tonnes of carbon, extra drawdown. So the potential is, can we do 20 billion tonnes of carbon per annum, extra drawdown for managing this 250 billion tonne? And the answer is yes, we can. It's 8%, and it's all doable. And in a sense, in Regenerate Earth, we've been we're working on about 21 specific projects in different parts of the world. These are real action programs. They're often not scaled up to the scale that we need them yet, but basically the solutions are there, whether it's cooling climates, rehydrating, regenerating arid areas, re-establishing ecological grazing systems, reforesting basically degraded lands. So there's lots of initiatives that are in play, being documented, being demonstrated by innovators. So yes, we can do 20 billion tonnes of carbon extra fixation. We can get to negative net emissions by 2030. Practically, profitably, through grassroots innovative action. And what we're really sort of making the point here is, here are all these simple, logical, natural solutions, and what we've done is we've simply ignored them all for 50 years because we've simply defined this as the problem. See, we've seen, in a sense, the CO2 increase and said, hey, there's blood on the floor, we've got to clean up the blood, but we don't ask the question, what's the cause of the blood? Where is the wound? How do we heal the wound? Okay? And we're really sort of coming back to the thing is, yes, of course we have to clean up the blood, but it's actually addressing the wound and building health back into this biosystem, and then that gives us this solution. Okay, so that's in a sense the carbon accounting story, but sorry, ladies and gentlemen, it's not good enough, right? Because nature's perversity. We know that nature's basically made of 71% sea, oceans, it's covered, and of course 29% land, of which, you know, some 3% is, in a sense, ice. And so we've got basically buffered ecological systems. The sea contains some 38,000 billion tons of carbon dissolved mainly as CO2 in it. The atmosphere has some 750 billion tons of carbon in the atmosphere. So you can see there's 50 times the amount of CO2 or carbon in the oceans and the atmosphere. And this is an equilibrated, buffered system. So if we say, okay, we're going to try to reduce these atmospheric emissions, and guess what we're doing, you know, 8 billion tons of emissions there, and hey, we reduce it 50%, that's 4. So we're reducing 4 billion tons of emissions a year. The oceans would simply burp and smile and put it back into the atmosphere, right? And so it will take centuries or millennia for us to get CO2 back down to below 350 parts per million, or what we would say is a stable climate. And so we can't solve this whole climate or whole dilemma, we're way past solving it just through management of CO2, because these ocean buffers, you know, are basically too big. But of course, the ocean buffers are giving us a clue, because that's based on water. And that's now the biggest secret. Because this 20 billion tons of carbon, we don't actually just simply say we have to account for, we have to draw down more, or put that onto balance sheet it. What we've got to do, we've got to put that into really the key line of all our agenda, the whole talk. We've got to put that carbon into regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. Okay? Because once we get that into the sponge, then we actually can rehydrate the planet. And this is the powerful thing then, because water becomes our key point of agency to change the climate. 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet for the last 4 billion years has been driven by water. Okay? A whole sequence of hydrological processes that drive that heat dynamics. We can go into the details of the physics and what have you. And the point is, it's carbon as a resource to rebuild the sponge that is now so critical in rehydrating the landscape, to making that water available, to make that cooling process. And that works again very simply, very elegantly, and again, it's what nature did 420 million years ago. It's called pedogenesis, and of course we started off basically with rocks. Okay, here was Lyle, a professor in Scotland, wasn't it? So here's a geology, the whole basis. But here are mineral rocks, and of course these minerals have got different, you know, magnesium and calcium and essential nutrients. But basically, while they're rock, they're heavy, they're fused together, and basically all these minerals are unavailable. Okay? And of course, when we put water on a rock, you know, again, what happens to it just runs off, doesn't it? And so we end up with, in a sense, an inert, dead mineral planet. But what nature did 420 million years ago, it grew basically fungi from the estuarine edge onto the rocky surface. It was running short of nutrients in the oceans because obviously life was teeming in the oceans from the Cambrian explosion onwards. Nutrients were the limiting factor. There were still nutrients available in these mineral rocks. And so nature basically took fungi and sort of said, hey, we want to solubilize, grow over these rocks on the land to solubilize nutrients. And in growing over those rocks on the land, of course, these fungi left behind organic detritus. And in doing so, it created, in a sense, a soil carbon sponge, which is simply the same mineral particles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, but this time the mineral particles are held apart, and I just draw them as bed springs because I think it gets the idea of the sponge. But the point is they're just held apart by organic detritus, waste, residual, fungal biomass. Okay, and now instead of having a rock, what do we have? We have an open porous sponge. A rock is 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc in terms of its volume weight, heavy, whereas healthy soils has got a bulk density of 1.2 grams per cc or thereabouts. And of course that's telling us straight away this healthy soil is made up 66% by nothing. Voids, air, void, space. And that's the powerful thing. See, that's what nature's done. Just by messing around, solubilizing, taking some of these nutrients, leaving behind detritus, it's fundamentally created a different matrix. And that matrix has fundamentally different properties. Because if we now put basically a drop of water on this sponge, we know what happens, doesn't it? It infiltrates, it'll form water films around those particles, and it'll create effectively the basis of life. And very rapidly it's this pedogenesis, this creation of soil, that then allowed vegetation and life to colonize the 14 billion hectares of ice-free land on this planet. And of course it's that water then that enabled that whole land system to function, the biodiversity to be established, but it's also that water that enabled the hydrology and the hydrological cooling processes to operate. And again, it's this water in these soils that is then fundamental to our life. What we've done, of course, since then, through our agriculture, through our land management, we've been very, very astute, or not astute, we're dumb actually, but the point is we've been basically taking out these carbon. We've been oxidizing the carbon out of those soils, so we're basically be emitting CO2, and we've been collapsing that structure back to more compacted, degraded, not quite rock, but really compacted soils with less voids, less water holding capacity, less nutrient availability. Because in a sense, not just do these voids open up the availability of holding water, but the surface area of soil particles that are now exposed, making these minerals available for uptake by life, again, has exponentially increased. In this case, we're degrading it. And so in a sense, we're seeing the land degradation process at the micromorphology level. Yes, the rock, nature created sponge, we've moved it backwards. If we want to regenerate healthy hydrology, healthy biofertility, resilience, productivity on our landscapes, it's clear we need to, again, avoid this. We've got to limit that degradation and accelerate more healthy soil development. Rebuilding the Earth's soil carbon sponge. That has then profound consequences. And basically, again, we can look at something in an engineering establishment, so we can actually do that because engineers get this very clearly. These are called hygrographs. And of course, it's a simple matter of flow. over time. And it's really what happens to water when, it rains, right? So if we get a 2 millimeter rainfall, a 2 inch rainfall event, 50 millimeter rainfall event at a point in time, and if we've got a degraded, compacted land system, what happens to that water? Well, we get a hydrograph which, basically with various shapes looks like this. Very, very high flood peak and very rapid runoff, but then all that water then runs off, drains away. But in doing so, obviously it floods. And in flooding it erodes. Okay, and then of course it causes damage. It creates risks, costs, and these costs are not just in the damage, but also just think of all the sunk engineering infrastructure we have to invest for storm waters and culverts and what have you, right? So we've basically put an enormous investment and consequence from this fact that, yes, these compacted soils can't hold water and drain water. It gets a little bit worse than that because basically the water that has flooded off by definition isn't available on the land anymore. So we've created droughts, and of course as a consequence of the droughts, again, we have erosion, we have damage, we have risk, we have costs, and we have events like wildfires. Okay, so really, again, we have created, we humans have designed in these disasters. They are the consequence of our land management. Now, we can call them acts of God and nature or whatever. We can call them 1 in 1,000 year events, but it's just externalizing. It's just, hot air. They're impacting us, our consequences, we have to take responsibility for them. And the issue is, well, how do we do that? And how did, in a sense, we get into this stupidity? And of course, this was in a system, a land system here, where basically we had degraded soil structure. And just say here in England, you might have had 2% carbon in those soils. And so your bed springs were, compromised. You didn't have that open structure. But if we basically regenerate soil and make that open, porous structure, and just say we bring that to 5% carbon, we get a fundamentally different hydrograph. So instead of all that water flooding off, we end up with a hydrograph that goes like this. And sure, we'll lose some water, runoff, no question. Whereas here, this guy was losing, of course, you see, it was losing all of that water for runoff, right? So we don't have the same flood peaks and stuff. But we've got something much, much more valuable, because now we've got reduced risk, cost, floods, etc., but also we've got our water in our in-soil reservoirs. Okay, and this is natural capital, this is actually resilience, this is productivity, because those in-soil reservoirs drive another thing which is powerful, which is a longevity of green. Okay, and that's something that's new, you see, because now basically instead of only being able to grow to say 10 days after this rainfall event, we can grow for 100 days after that rainfall event. That's 1,000% growth response. Okay, where do you get 1,000% growth response in any natural system, in any agricultural system? Come on, when I was a young scientist, Green Revolution, we get a 20% growth response, we get a clean lab coat, new clipboard, and queue up for a Nobel Prize. Wishing. But the point is 1,000%, tenfold productivity resilience. And so we're not just offering you, hey, we can avoid these costs as damage. Here is an opportunity, a tenfold productivity dividend on our land systems. And all through regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. Okay? So we've come to this journey where we've consistently, set context for ourselves that became our own black holes, our own limitations, our own, damaging default. Whether it's a CO2 thing as a problem rather than as a resource, whereas ignoring the capacity of natural systems, and we spent all our money and social capital and economic capital and fighting, that red hydrograph, right? And so it goes with whether it's preventative health or other consequences. And it's just a question of saying, okay, step back, look at, redefine this concept more holistically, see the holism, the whole wider context of relationships, and then the answers become self-apparent. And of course, what we and Regenerate Earth is simply doing is to say, shining a light on, hey, guys, here are solutions, here are options. Here's profitable, practical, winnable things. But the serious thing I don't know how to do, is time, right? We're not time lords. We have 9 years because these dangerous hydrological extremes and stuff are accelerating now. And unless we built the buffering resilience, like the in-soil reservoirs and the biodiversity back into our biosystem, the danger is that people will fall apart. Syria, but not just Syria, last year British Columbia burnt. British Columbia doesn't burn. It'll take 500 years for those British Columbian forests to re-establish. But it's not just British Columbia, it's Siberia, it's Greece, it's Portugal, it's Australia, it's California, over and over and over again. You see? So this default, no, I've taken the wildfire. So basically it's these things that really we have to start designing for and saying, okay, how do we avoid them? And the proposition we're putting is, in a sense, yes, nature has these solutions. There's a sponge, and as long as we focus on putting that carbon back into the soil, in the sponge, we can automatically, as we've showed with the petagenesis diagram, we can automatically build the sponge, and with that we can cool the planet. So let's just go into cooling the planet. I mean, like, as I said, there's about 20 key initiatives that we're running, including how do we cool the planet. And they say, hey, that's impossible. How do we cool the planet, right? And the answer is, well, simple. Because we need to cool the planet, therefore we should do it. Okay, if we have a tree, and it's got its roots in the ground, and of course that root has water, that's important. You see, we've got H2O, that's the key thing, that's what we've again talked about. That tree is of course transpiring water from its leaves. Okay, 40,000 litres per hectare per day. Okay, doesn't matter if your forest isn't doing quite that much, but it'll do it. And every gram of that water needs 590 calories of heat energy per gram to turn from the liquid, from the soil, into the gas water vapour that it can transpire with. Okay? So just think of how much energy this transpiring forest, woodland, has to take from this surface environment to basically transpire. And this latent heat of evaporation, which is in a sense what this is, just simple physics, is actually responsible for cooling 24% of the incident solar radiation on this planet. Okay, talking about Earth's climate, so we might as well talk. There's a planet, 342 watts per square metre coming into it continually. Obviously a balanced temperature has to have 342 watts per square metre going back out, otherwise it's cooking. And it is cooking because basically we have enhanced the greenhouse effect, and now instead of 342 watts we've only got 339 watts per square metre going out, and so 3 watts per square metre are coming back in. Houston, we have a problem. We are retaining about 1% extra heat energy on this planet compared to stability. We've just had this tree that's telling us forests are doing 24% of this solar radiation. They take about 85 watts per square metre back out from the surface to space. So theoretically, a 4% increase in tree cover would cool the planet, 1%. Now, it's not quite that simple. There's more relationships. But the fact is that can we cool the planet hydrologically through nature? Yes, we can. There's a whole other sequence of processes. I don't want to go into more. But the point is to say, yeah, that water goes up in the air. Does it form humid hazes, which absorb heat, both basically incident solar radiation as well as greenhouse gases, and actually warm the atmosphere, or does it form clouds? If these guys form clouds, okay, if these hazes form clouds, what happens? See, clouds reflect 120 watts per square metre on average globally back out to space. Okay, so again, cooling the planet underneath. We know that. Clouds come over, we put on a jumper. Simple. You see? And so basically here are processes. But again, for clouds to form, they've got to have water. That water has to be transpired, evaporated. Hey, it depends on the earth, soil, carbon, sponge. You see? And so it's re-establishing this hydrological cycle, is re-establishing these natural cooling processes. Really critical. There's another thing that's actually very powerful in terms of cooling the planet, which basically has come forward from our work in India. And basically in India, you've got a monsoonal season, and so the land is red often for 60%, 70% of the time, and it's green for the remaining 40%. Okay, so this is when you have plant cover, but then they harvest their crops, and of course, then it goes back to bare fallow. And of course, we've got bare fallows everywhere in agriculture, equivalent to this. And of course, by definition, there's sunlight coming onto these lands, and of course, here it's green and it's it's evaporating, transpiring. So very rarely do you get temperatures under green protected soil covers of 20 degrees centigrade. Mostly it's below 20 degrees centigrade, right? Because of these protective shading, but also the hydrological cooling effect. Whereas we know, and come to Australia anytime, these things heat up, obviously the solar energy, and we can get up to 70 degrees centigrade soil temperatures, right? You can't walk on them, even your Chinese thongs get sticky, right? Thongs, yeah. Flip-flop. So speak a different language. Okay, and this is, but just self-evident, isn't it? It's self-evident. But see, there's another bigger thing. Now, if I ask the room, we're all intelligent people, we ask them, what drives the greenhouse effect? Come on, what would people say? What drives the greenhouse effect? Everything, okay. He's covering all his bets one way. But obviously the message we've been sold, the greenhouse effect, greenhouse effect, and we get sold, oh, look, it's CO2, like the gases in the air absorbing it, right? And of course, yes, the CO2 is one of the gases, but the greenhouse effect in reality is driven by the re-radiation from the Earth times the percentage of that re-radiation absorbed by greenhouse gases, of which water vapor is 80%, CO2 is 11%, and methane and nitrous oxide is 9%. Okay, so what we're really saying is the greenhouse effect is actually driven by re-radiation, and of course then the percentage of that re-radiation that is absorbed, and of course CO2, no question, is a component, and it does about 4% of the global heat dynamics through that component process of the greenhouse effect. But of course that's all we've constrained ourselves, shackled ourselves to think about. Okay? Now here's something that's stunning, and again, it's physics, it's engineering, it's indisputable. the amount of re-radiation from any black body radiator, equivalent to the Earth, is governed by the Stefan-Boltzmann law of black body radiation. No one disputes it. It's a bit like E equals mc squared. It's a constant times temperature to the power of 4 in degrees Kelvin. And what that means is it's governed by temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature. So the question is, this hot surface is going to re-radiate massively more heat back into the air than a cool, moist, hydrated surface. Physics, can't escape it. You know, Stefan-Boltzmann, temperature, fourth power, enormous. So what the Stefan-Boltzmann equation is telling us, effectively, that if we can keep if we don't mow our lawns, now that's a bit heretical, I think everyone wants to mow their lawns, but if we don't mow our lawns, if we keep our land surfaces green, protected and covered, we can actually reduce the temperature enormously, comparatively, and we can enormously reduce this amount of re-radiation. So now the perspective comes, and tell me if I'm wrong, we can actually turn down the greenhouse effect within weeks, significantly, simply by regenerating and rehydrating landscapes. Now, we gave you the sad story here that it's going to be, hundreds of years, millennia. We're doomed. And now you've got the sad story, you may not be able to mow your lawns. You may need to regreen this planet. So how serious is that? Okay? And so the answer is yes, yes we can. We can easily basically do that. And this is again where India comes in. And so Vijay, my colleague in Andhra Pradesh, we're saying yes, here is 40% green, 60% red. Can we extend green cover over those landscapes? He's got 1 million poor women farmers, often only on 1 acre land or less, doing natural farming. Why? Because they're beyond the green revolution. You know, they basically haven't got money for fertilizers. They've drained all their aquifers. Their husbands have all committed suicide or died with basically biocide toxic, death. And basically the answer is, okay, all they've got left is the desperate need to feed their children. So natural farming, and they've gone back to natural farming. We've been helping them through all these processes. How do we enhance the biofertility, the nutrient availability, the water hydrology, and they are basically getting 300% growth responses through these ecological natural farming processes, but also they're extending green across that landscape. And we've taken that further through a concept that we call pre-monsoon dry seeding. So I can do it over that one, because they're flips. And where we're basically saying, okay, can we actually take the same natural farming components? Can we take, basically, obviously, seed, microbes, specific soil microbes, organic matter, biostimulants, we'll come into this, and basically some clay binders. And can we actually sort of put these into pellets? And can we sow those pellets into those arid zone areas before the rain and get arid zone vegetation established? Because this is exactly what 95% of Australia's deserts are still green, because they've got these natural processes, enabling seeds to start. And of course we can do this successfully. And so this is now pre-monsoon dry seeding, and we're using this to extend green across these biosystems to the point that we're getting 365-day green cover over large areas, right? Now, they're not highly productive. They're often millets and cucurbits and very, very arid-adapted plants, but we're creating these green covers. And what we're doing now here, asking this question, is one of our Regenerate Earth innovation realities. I mean, they're realities, but challenges. Can we take 1 billion hectares of man-made wasteland, arid wasteland, to regreen that? Because if we can do it at that scale, then it's enough to, again, significantly help cool the planet. Stephen Bolton. Okay? And so what I'm saying is, here are the sort of points of agencies. I mean, there's lots of others, but what I'm saying, here are the sort of points of agency that we, if we step outside the confines of the context that we've locked ourselves in, if we look holistically, if we look synergistically, can we actually regenerate biosystems? Okay, so these are the sort of opportunities we've got, but it's really us as grassroots innovators. We're standing here, Brunel, these are the people who, again, mavericks, innovators who are saying, yes, we can design, yes, we can understand, yes, we can regenerate. Because this grassroots will come from farmers like in India, but it will all come from innovative graziers, farmers everywhere. And it's really that grassroots empowerment. But we need this action at scale now. Obviously, we need to bring on board the corporate, investors looking at long-term, like stability for their own investments, regenerating land capital, regenerating social capital. And obviously, if we can do this, yes, governments will come on board, but at the moment, governments are very much confined to short-term, opportunist, media-driven, opportunities. So this is now not just the challenge, not just the imperative, but also the opportunity that, in a sense, we have through regenerating Earth, a whole lot of different frontiers, but also all of them getting back to the basics to say, here is regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge as a point of agency, the point of change. Just simply taking carbon from the air through photosynthesis and putting it back into rebuilding the soil carbon sponge. Now, lots of detail more to follow, and we can flesh that out in the question times and stuff like that on how we do, how do we build 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum? How do we build 20 billion tonnes of carbon, or draw down 20 billion tonnes of carbon per annum globally? All the answers are there. And obviously, it's not just me giving you answers, it's also me listening to your questions so I know what answers to give. So look, let's take a break now, and basically please come back, and then please come back with all the questions. Now obviously, this is nature, the evidence is there, we're not disputing nature. I mean, don't, because you're dependent on it. But the point is, with the science, the explanation, yes, we can substantiate all of this. There's points of application detail that we still need to know, but we'll only know by doing it, right? It's a bit like building a railway, right? You only work out the fine points of how to optimize it by operating one. Okay, so come back and please, please, please ask those questions, because that's where, like a group like us really can get powerful insight and take this thing further.
Are you braced?
Yeah, we're all braced. No, this was good. This is good. No, this is good. So look, yeah, let's have that debate. Let's ask all the questions. There's no question that's wrong, because basically, and I'm sure lots of us will be looking at the same angle, and I think we can really cover, the missing links best through these questions. So please.
Yes, obviously water vapour is quite crucial, but how come the orthodoxy is not really factoring that into the...
How come the orthodoxy is not factoring in? Obviously, water vapour is so fundamentally in this climate debate, so why isn't it being factored? Why hasn't it been factored in? Okay, well, it was very, very simple. It was actually Jimmy Carter in 1978. We had, of course, Charles Keeling came and gave this beautiful graph. And Jimmy, you know, genuine guy and all that sort of stuff. And he said, right, well, this is important. We've got to be ahead of the game. So I commissioned the Scripps Oceanographic Institute in San Diego and Los Alamos, New Mexico, to actually go through the physics of this CO2, the whole greenhouse, and basically what's real, what's not real, and what are the consequences to America, right? Because hey, America's about $1. So what are the consequences to America? And of course, these physicists, they're smart cookies. They know all about the water drives 95% of the heat planet, and they know about water drives the greenhouse effect. But what they also know is that, no, we can't actually quantify water. It is so variable in time and place, we haven't got algorithms that, quantify it. But CO2 is easily quantified. It's fixed, etc. Cervantes Arrhenius, 1896, actually did the sums on candlelight on the back of postage or envelopes, right? So the point is we can mathematically quantify it. We can model CO2. We can't model water. It's far too dynamic. And so they basically reframed, and this is in a sense exactly what we're not blaming them, but they set the context. Okay, the brief from the president was, what is the consequence of this CO2 rise? Not what is the consequence of human changes to the whole climatic system. Okay? The other thing they said, yeah, look, no question, way back climatology 101 to WAFA, like when I was studying in the 60s. 95% of the heat dynamics, that 342 watts per square meter is driven by hydrology. So they made the assumption, quite reasonably, that, look, we humans could not possibly have altered that water cycle. Again, we've got it here. 71% of the planet, 4,000 meters deep, is oceans. Have we affected the oceans? Homo hubris, Homo hubris is pretty sharp, but has Homo hubris affected the oceans? And at that stage they said, too hard, beyond our pay grade, right? And so they just did the design on CO2, came back with a story to say, hey, CO2 is going to be beneficial because we can grow more wheat up in Wisconsin. There'll be a longer growing season. We might get a bit more moisture, etc., etc. So it's okay. But it was only Maggie Thatcher. She came in 79, only early 80s. She had done chemistry. She was a scientist. And she said, hey, Ronald, don't kid yourself. This climate change is real. You've got to take it seriously. And it was only Maggie Thatcher that actually sort of put it onto the map. Okay, so that's why water vapor was largely ignored, but it's just too complicated, too variable, impossible to model, and like they wanted a good guy, bad guy, simple analogy. Again, it happened, get a lot of history here. Vilnius, Austria, 85, where again in this whole, Stockholm had set up a very sophisticated, thorough analysis of Earth system science, all the processes, all the dynamics. That was doing excellent work, but it was getting more and more complicated because the planet is complicated. And so they had to simplify it and get it back to good guys, bad guys. So basically in 85 they decided, look, let's just focus on the bad guys, CO2 greenhouse, and of course then the UNFCCC and the IPCC process for the last 30 years has focused largely on CO2 greenhouse. They've spent $80 billion US modelling it, but basically they've framed all that modelling on that context, on this context. Okay, so that's just history, yeah.
Construction and civil engineering feel a million miles away to what happens in the field. So can you expand on how you see the ways that very substantial industry and those that work in it and around it can be helping with this re-greening?
Okay, so thank you very much. In a multitude of ways. First of all, is component materials. So you've got calcium carbonate, cements, in limestone, making cements. So how much is cement contributing to the emissions, right? Because you've got to take calcium carbonate, heat it, and you give off CO2 to get the calcium oxide to make the cements. So in that thing. But most importantly, actually, it's how we design that urban environment, right? How do we design it for energy efficiency internally in terms of buildings, but also how we look at the buildings and look at, see, transport costs, all those infrastructure costs embedded in how we design. I live in Canberra. Basically, it's 100 years old. It was designed as a garden city. And I think, as I said, 10 centimetres cooler on a hot summer's day, 40 degrees centigrade day, compared to the concrete jungles nearby. So if we design urban systems with porous pavements, green spaces, urban forests, we can create a habitat which is basically naturally cool, but 10 times more important than being naturally cool, doesn't have the heat stresses which become the real health risk consequences to older people, invalid people, and we don't have the thousands of people dying as we had in Paris in 2003. You see, and so it's often tertiary, quaternary, subsequent effects. So the design of urban areas, enormously important. Urban design, water even more critical, important. We can design urban areas basically with endless safe water through recycling systems, right? So we can have, in a sense, autonomous, endless safe water in urban management systems. Or we can have a linear flow model needing 300 litres per person per day, which then creates enormous infrastructure costs, concrete and consequences. So look, it's all up to us, it's all up to design. Construction, very important in each of those carbon accounting, water accounting areas, but that applies in a sense to every sector. The whole concept of industrial ecology, redesigning for efficiency, recycling applies, but urban agriculture, urban design can be a real leader in that.
These are, thank you, Walter, these are great ways that the industry can take direct action for these secondary, tertiary effects. Industries, by default, are huge employers.
Yep.
So could you talk about the ways that individuals, as it were, can be encouraged by said employers to be engaging in the habits that would be driving the demand for the sorts of, say, food, for example, could come from regenerative sources, etc. Actually making that link.
Okay. Okay. No, and it goes bigger and bigger, and this comes into where Christopher and I and Edward are very, very closely looking at the metrics, right? What we've really got to do, we've got to start becoming honest and really critically looking at the valid metrics. At the moment, we externalize, subsidize, and protect all the things we don't want to face up to in our balance sheets, right? And they're completely fraudulent, because if you looked at the real costs and consequences, as we said, we've got a cooler urban area, we're saving 10 times as much money in health savings, and those things are they're being ignored, they're not being factored in. So these metrics allow us to look at the real costs, the real consequences, put them into the balance sheet, and that will then drive, the systems change. From an individual point of view, I don't know if you've got so much licensing in the UK, certainly not in big cities like London, but in Australia, for example, now we still have a choice. Do we want to build a house? For example, we're in one of our projects from Tasmania looking to put affordable, architecturally designed timber kit housing, poles and panels, very sophisticated panels and poles, onto the market at 20% current housing costs, because it's affordability to youth, and can we have cluster infill, architecturally designed housing based on timber? You see, and can we grow that timber, carbon sequester that timber, but also provide affordable housing? But I don't know how much that's market by market, region by region. Another area in terms of the construction industry, but not just construction, engineering, hey, we're in engineering mecca, is, look, here's carbon fibre, right? Okay, we've been using steel and concrete, but here's carbon fibre composites. So how much can we do lightweight carbon fibre composites which we can recycle continually, and where's the feedstock, where's this sort of technology from going from activated carbon, graphene and those sort of things. So there's a lot of really clever new material opportunities as well.
Yeah, sorry, another engineering comment here. I am a civil engineer. I did start coming to what can the built environment do in terms of reducing that 4% of carbon that you're showing there. But very quickly coming to the point, the assets that we design and build, they are taking up land.
Yes.
That land that you're saying, can we start greening up and so on. There is a much bigger role that engineering can play in thinking land use.
Yes.
Both in terms of resilience from climate,
yes,
else, that holding of water, how we design with nature in mind
totally.
To play the role of the concrete and steel and design for. And I think that's a much bigger.
Yes, and efficient use of land, and I mean, like if you get America and you've got these strip, urban areas, whereas Europe at least is intelligent enough to restrict towns to a town area, and then they have sustainable agricultural land. But actually, I'd like to take a step further. Like Canberra, where I live, was designed 100 years ago, Marion Mahoney, Walter Burley Griffin, as a green, 20th century garden city, and extremely effective because we can integrate the green with the urban, right? Basically porous pavements, right? Just simply porous pavements, because the actual building footprint is, yes, certainly there, a certain percentage, but compared to all the area. And if we can have the rest of it porous pavement, urban forests, we can actually create a really wonderful, balanced, cooling, biodiverse, enriched habitat in our urban areas. So by no means is it, here's Garden of Eden and here's an urban concentration. We can have both together wonderfully. It's just a matter of design, passion and will.
If I may say
yeah, please.
Because, I like the way you're telling the story around water and how important it is. The very London we live here, that we are in at the moment, we have put all our wonderful rivers in culverts and they're running straight into sewers.
Totally.
The amount of stuff we could be doing by just at least bringing that water back.
Yep. As a case in point, the challenge, I was in New Delhi on the 25th of April on my way here, and the Chief Minister Andhra Pradesh says, right, okay, we've got thousands of villages, we're literally out of water, litres per person per day. That's, if that goes, it's death, literally. So how do we go into each village, define watersheds, and how do we use these accelerated regreening strategies to at least secure those watersheds, the in-soil reservoirs, so can we guarantee, 5 litres per person per day. We're still using 200 litres, I imagine, in London. Right.
So it strikes me as a similar story going back to agriculture. It's that whole idea of either or, and instead of saying it's either we use the hell out of it, in farming, which is my background, so many of my acquaintances are like, well, that's fine, we've got a bit over here we've left for nature, and then we farm the hell out of this bit over here and we pile on the chemicals. My question, I suppose, is where does, you've got a country like India where they can't afford the chemicals and they've napped the soil so badly it doesn't work anyway. In the UK and a lot of the Western world, where does the use of the chemical fertilizers and the insecticides and everything, where does that fit in with?
Okay, look, important. And I agree. We've created, only since the Second World War, so don't think about this as God-given or permanent. We've created this moron agriculture. You've got to spell it right, M-O-R-E-O-N, don't get the wrong word. We've created this moron agriculture, right? And obviously it makes money, right? It makes money not for you. It makes money out of you killing yourself, you exploiting your land, and somebody else taking profit, selling you inputs, right? That's the profit motive behind that. But what the easy, elegant thing is, as in nature, you just say, look, can I bring things back into cycles, right? Can I, on my farming management, bring everything back into cycle? I'm growing plants, I'm feeding those to animals. Can I cycle that? Yes, I've got biofertility through dung and what have you. Can I cycle it, right? And so can you design your agriculture ever more into cycles? And we're hitting that wall now. We've got Russia and Ukraine having a blue. We call that in Australia fight. And then basically 40% of the world's wheat futures is Russian and Ukraine wheat. That's obviously not going to be there. Massive increase in fertilizer prices, right? 300% spike, for example, my mates in Tasmania. And so now the question is, right, hang on, how do I enhance biofertility in soils? You know, can I use 20%, 10% of the fertilizers, but if I can basically increase the fixation, solubilization, access, availability and cycling of those nutrients, because I've designed those systems better, we're looking at, can we give you a factor 5 biofertility improvement using 10-20% of the quantity of fertilizer, because we're taking this opportunity to rebuild biofertility. The minerals haven't left this planet, they're still there. They're often in the oceans because that's where we've leached them, okay? But the point is, can we build those cycles? And I've obviously even talking about, well, what does seaweeds and stuff, they harvest those and we're using them again as organic fertilizers. So what I'm getting at is, can we redesign systems to cycle, to make better fixation, solubilizing, all those microbial processes? And then can we, sometimes we still have to add them, but can we basically do fractions of what we need? Because as we currently use, like nitrogen, 90% of it is either volatilized, leached, or otherwise creating very, very soft, disease-susceptible plants. Unproductive. 98% of the phosphorus we put on our soils is locked up and included within weeks on iron, aluminium oxides around soil particles. And it's only microbes, you know, these processes to keep that available. If we keep those microbial cycles going, we don't need to add them. Behind you, yeah.
I come from a similar background. I've turned into regenerative farming. But the problem is with general farmers, they're locked into a cycle with borrowed money.
Yes.
And they can't get out of it.
Yes.
And to turn to a regenerative system,
yes,
it takes a minimum of 3 to 4 years depending on how.
No, absolutely. And
how do we get?
Right. Now you're asking me to talk about revolutions. Come on.
Because I would just add there, because I did sit through and I did have a go at the fertiliser rep,
yeah,
who a few weeks ago was telling a room full of farmers that fertiliser at £800 a tonne, and is now £1,000 a tonne,
yeah,
was still the cheapest end they will buy, because wheat is £300 a tonne, therefore it's all okay.
Yeah, and nitrogen from the air is free and beneficial.
Yeah, I suppose the question is exactly that mirror.
Yeah.
How do you
okay,
break the
yeah, okay, I know, look, no, but you're asking me a sociological, look, those guys are obviously in the business of making money. Those guys in the business of selling you those sorts of stories and keeping that pressure. Those guys are in the business of buying politicians that put in laws to say, yeah, you're regulated to require X, Y, Z. It's called protection rackets. It's the way, that's capitalism. Come on, that's the way this world works. You know, come on. The person sitting next to you comes from America. They perfected it. It was in the States, case in point in the States, they're putting $1 trillion a year of public taxes into the farm bill, the farm subsidy scheme. But to get the farm subsidy schemes, you've got to be using these chemicals and these fertilizers and covered with this and doing those conventional things. So anyone that's innovative is excluded. So guess what? It's 95% of that $1 trillion is going back to the big corporates.
The whole system is corrupt.
You can't say that. Yeah, you come from America. But no, okay, but so look, and then you say, how do you bust out of that?
Exactly.
And it's hard. Now, the question is, we have to bust out of it because business as usual is death. And so the point is, before death, how do you get together and say, hey, look, let's bootstrap, or do I sidestep? I mean, I think, look, this is coming to personal discussion. You've got to really look at what do I do but you know that you're on a racket and you're being screwed. And how do you get out of it?
The world is not totally lost. Not everyone is in a rat.
No.
I apologise, I'm going to take 1 second.
Yeah.
Just say that regenerative asset management reforms here today, we are creating a way of getting investors' money to come in to fill that 4-year gap, to help farmers overcome that, to be educated in regenerative farming, to move on from the way they're farming, and we will then help them to sell that carbon to form another revenue flow going forward.
Yeah.
So there are some investors out there who want to understand this, who are beginning to think that, who are trying to change.
Yeah.
Let's have a chat after.
Yeah.
Presumably you were
I don't need it.
And we're doing the same thing, both
Yeah.
in North America and here in the UK. And
Yeah. But look,
I think the challenge is understanding the costs and defining the benefits,
and this,
and that requires an understanding of the science.
and it's understanding always the reality that we're in, and it's understanding, are we being sold a certain position? Are there other options? Are we going to be stuck in that black hole, or are we willing to look beyond it? But, okay, yeah.
Alex, New Foundation Farms, also another startup in the space that is looking to transition the face of agriculture to a more natural, biodiversity-friendly, carbon-positive way to produce food that the farmer doesn't get screwed from. So also happy to speak to you guys at the end of the market.
Yeah.
And also, to that point, if we look to the world of climate change and transition of industry, number one, the biggest GHG emitter is, of course, energy. And you look at the transition, although it's slow, to renewables, that is happening. The second biggest GHG emitter is transport, EVs. They're coming, they're past the 6% inflection point. Their sales are now outstripping ICE cars in the UK. The third biggest GHG emitter is agriculture. We're just at the start of the journey though.
Yeah.
Shipping as well. Shipping's a real problem. It's the main problem, transport.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
and with everyone offshore now.
You want to talk about methane? Okay. Okay, but look, just anything. The other thing is, you alone by design are so vulnerable and impotent, right? But so if you join locally as a team level, syndicate some of these strategies, ask the questions, how do we operate? Liaise with people, like in a sense, say, look, what are the design options? What are other people doing? Then there are ways through that. But it's often not just, listening to your fertilizer rep.
A drumbeat narrative which is getting serious as a result of the FAO livestock long shadow is perpetuating the idea that methane from ruminants is an issue.
Right, methane. Methane. Okay, well look, no, this is actually, again, beautiful, and it really epitomizes all what we've been saying and what are sort of like the imperatives we're facing, but also the solutions, right? Methane, of course, is a very elegant, simple little product, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogen, and it's produced basically geologically, from volcanoes down in the earth, because this is carbon burning without enough oxygen, but also it's produced in the anaerobic biodigestion of animals, including us, but including cows, right? So it's part like CO2 of that cycle. And for the last millions of years, there's been methane in the atmosphere, and it's been there at about 700 parts per billion. So there's been traces of methane in the atmosphere, right? And it's part of that natural cycle. And basically there's about 1,600 million metric tons of methane produced, and basically most of it is produced, as I said, fugitive emissions from geology, wetlands, termites, landfills, and basically 10%, some 160 million metric tons from herbivores. But this is, as I said, like all the different herbivores. And cattle, about 10%, so you might say there's 60 million metric tons from cattle, right? And so that's the story. But the point is, yes, we've got cattle on this planet, we've got sheep on this, we've got people on this planet producing methane. And the answer is, the biomass of those people is no greater than the biomass of the herbivores that there were before. If you look at the herds of bison, impala, wildebeest, zebras, like there's been herbivores, okay, some 14 billion hectares of land, 8 billion hectares of primary forest, 6 billion hectares of primary grassland. Those grasslands had their synergistic herbivores. They couldn't have survived without them. Grasslands are, synergies with herbivores. And basically there was more herbivore biomass, previously, but that's okay. So we've got these things, we used to call them daisies, but now we have to call them patsies, right? Because they're getting it in the neck. That's why they name change. So cows are bad, and so we've got this sort of FAO and stuff like that. And again, always vested interest involved, and saying, hang on, methane, of course, methane is a greenhouse gas. We showed that before on the thing. It's 9% of the greenhouse gas effect when we had that re-radiation. Well, not actually, it's not 9% by itself, because with nitrous oxide and others, so it's, it's a minor, less than 10% greenhouse gas. And we've made a big beat up about methane. Why? Because people don't like meat and people want to get away from meat. Now, there's a very important caveat here. For the last 50 years, we've done something horrible, right? We've taken animals away from their natural grasslands. We put them into concentration camps we call CAFOs, or factory farms, and they grow in very, very undesirable, unethical conditions, in my opinion. They also produce lots of effluent that then isn't spread out, re-fertilizing the grasslands as it was intended. They're basically creating sewage ponds, which again give off vast quantity of methane, but also do a lot of local water pollution. So we're not in any way trying to defend that factory farming model, because we see herbivores, cattle, as far, far too important to be in the grassland ecology. You'll see why. But so basically we're saying, look, these guys, yeah, they're doing just say 1 to 2% of the methane emissions, but obviously they're the patsies. Why? And as I said, because these factory farming interests know that they're emitting lots of methane, but they're basically saying, hang on, let's spread the liability, spread the load. But now we've got something actually more ominous coming on. I don't know if you're in it. Prince Charles was talking about 20 years ago called grey goo. And this is manufactured meat, right? Now the question is, instead of growing meat through animals, can we actually grow maize? We've got lots of GE maize that we can't sell because no one wants to eat it. We've got lots of GE soybeans that, again, nobody should be eating or wants to eat because nobody can sell it. And can we turn it instead through amino acids and sugars in the laboratory through microbial processes, biotechnology into proteins? We can, chains of amino acid proteins. And can we sell the human population manufactured meat, or grey goo, as Prince Charles would call it, right? And can we market that? And hey, this is fantastic because we cut out a lot of the liabilities on their accounting, and we can actually take over the global meat market. Okay, each of the 9 billion people, 2030, will need some 100 grams of protein per person per day for their amino acid and their health. I don't know if the grey goo will satisfy, but basically that's what we need from a protein source. And so they're saying, hey, here's a market, right? And of course they've been using this methane story to say, hey, we've got to get away from cattle into this other prospect. There's billions and billions of dollars of venture capital behind manufactured meat, because if they can corner that, that's industrial food on steroids, literally. Okay, and so that's the story, you see? And so that's, in a sense, what you're up against. And in a sense, you've got to ask yourself, well, yes, I'm getting at the neck because of that story, but is that the truth? And the truth is, because it's 700 parts per billion, right away in the beginning, everyone would have said, well, hang on, if it's 700 parts per billion, we've had more cattle, there must be a process that actually removes methane from the biosphere. You know, you can't have 700 parts per billion with all those buffaloes running around, right? And of course there is. And it's a very, very beautiful, elegant, simple process. Again, fully scientific. No one argues about it scientifically.
Sorry, I want that. 700 is today?
No. That was the part. No, it's gone up since. Yeah,
Okay.
it's 700 parts was a sort of stable atmospheric level through humanity, but recently it's gone up. I'll come into that. Okay, and so what's happened is basically if you have a grassland, okay, and obviously grasslands then, as we've already said, transpire water. And when that water vapor basically interacts with sunlight, so we've got a sun up here, it'll dissociate, and so it'll form hydroxyl ions and hydrogen ions, which then link up to form bicarbonate ions, right? It's 2CO3. Okay. Anyway, basically it'll form hydroxyl ion and hydrogen ions and bicarbonates. And the point I'm making is that these hydroxyl ions are actually the Earth's laundry, atmospheric laundry, right? They are the things that clean up not just methane, but polyaromatic carbon, particulate carbon. So these hydroxyl ions are very, very effective at breaking down methane. And guess what? There's some 1,600 million metric tons a year of hydroxyl ions roughly produced by this process. And of course it's this process then that has effectively negated the methane and really basically kept that at a trace level. Okay, now Edmund is right. Basically in the 1990s methane levels didn't stay at 1600, they went up to, at 700, they went up to about 1600 parts per billion. And again, cattle got the blame, but in fact the radioactive isotopes on this extra methane says, no, it wasn't recent methane, it's old fossil methane. It was actually the USSR had sort of collapsed, and Mr. Yeltsin wasn't able to maintain his gas fields in terms of fugitive emissions, and basically this was largely fugitive emission from Russian gas infrastructure going into the air. It went up in 2010s, it went even further to 2,400 parts per billion, which is in a sense what I think you would have alluded to. And again, that's directly, geologically associated with fracking in the US. You know, if we go and frack, we basically fissure soils, and obviously fugitive emissions go up, but it's an externality of fracking, so we don't have to take it seriously, do we? Okay, coming in a second, yeah. So the point is that, yes, it's gone up, and of course cattle are being to blame. But here's the crunch point, you see, because the thing that makes this green pasture and maintains this green pasture are in fact herbivores. If you don't have herbivores eating and fertilizing and cycling this green pasture, we know any grass grows rank, dry, burns, produces methane, carbon, particulates, and turns to desert. And so the only thing that keeps it as a green photosynthetic pasture are actually herbivores. And a cow will basically maintain, 2 hectares of green pasture, grazing ecologically, which will basically produce about 100 times the hydroxyl ions that offset its, 100 times more hydroxyl ions than its emissions of methane required to oxidize. So in fact, instead of Patsy being a methane problem, Patsy is the methane solution. Okay, coming second? Yeah, good. Now we've got another bigger problem though. We can put it all into one page, but this is very serious stuff now. There are also some 15,000 billion tons of carbon as methane locked up in the Earth's tundras, ice caps and methane hydrates in the ocean sediments. I mean, these are in the ocean shelves. And as the oceans warm, and these oceans, we haven't put it here, these oceans are they're taking 93% of the additional heat we're putting into the planet, right? So the oceans at the moment are acting as this massive buffer, taking 93% of the extra heat we're cooking the planet with. So we haven't seen anything yet. But as these oceans are warming because of that, these Arctic oceans are already bubbling. It's a bit like lemonade, the report are. You know, there's methane bubbling up. It's like lemonade. And the danger is if these methane hydrates do release in large quantities, and there's vast quantities there obviously, then it's an existential extinction event. No question, right? It's happened before, but if we get a methane saturation in the atmosphere, it gets very serious. And the only hope in hell we have of avoiding that are daisies. Enough cattle, maintaining enough green pastures at high latitudes to keep enough hydroxyl ions from photooxidizing any emission release. So really, I mean, it's a classic story of you being sold not methane but bullshit, right? Because it's just context, context, context. We've looked again, as with CO2, here's a product. Oh, it's bad. Even if it's at that low, it's bad. Therefore, we've got to label it bad. We've got to punish the source. We've got to focus on eliminating the source rather than looking at the whole picture of these hydroxyl ions. Where do they come from? What are the processes that drive them? And what role do they play ecologically long-term as a critical planetary buffering safety net?
Water is also not an issue with the way that the CO2 equivalent of methane is calculated, because its life cycle is very much shorter.
Yes.
And it's an accountancy trick.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this stuff from green pastures basically lasts only days, right? I mean, like, this cycles within days. There's also methanotrophs in the soil, you know, bugs that live on methane. But yeah, look, I agree. It's bullshit, yeah? And the bullshit is better as fertilizer than in this stuff. But, yeah. But look, hang on, sorry.
Well, I was just going to ask, are you seeing any impact in the breakdown of the tundra and Arctic? Because you're seeing permafrost.
Yeah. Look, okay, this stuff is definitely dynamic. Yes, Alaska is going haywire because it used to have permafrost. They built buildings on it. Now it's all melting, and of course it's sinking and sinkholes, and there's no straight road anymore if there is a road. And enormous infrastructure costs. So we're in that stage. We're losing so much carbon from that. As methane and as CO2 from those systems. But the question is, can we keep that in balance from that earlier Keelan curve game, right? But if it becomes a mass release because of the warming of those oceans on the continental shelves, then it's one of these existential risks, right? Yeah.
Is that factored into the 2400 that you're already talking about?
No. Look, that was basically what the readings are, and of course that just put extra pressure on cattle. But again, through radioisotopes, they traced it back to fugitive emissions, and it was just part of the blame game, right? But look, at the moment, the question, and this is not cattle now. This is caribou, reindeer, high altitude. I mean, not high latitude herbivores, because if we can have that hydroxyl ion production as close as possible to that source, we can neutralize it, hopefully.
Thank you, Walter, for explaining that scientifically. I normally go for it's not the cow, it's the how. For those of us that are livestock advocates, what do you think is the best rebuttal to Joe Public to explain that these animals are not only, if they're raised in the correct setting, are climate positive, but is it that, or is it nutritional density?
Okay. Well, look, first of all, absolutely. As I sort of said, 14 billion hectares of land, there was 8 billion hectares of primary forest. there was 6 billion hectares of grassland. We've cleared 6.3 billion hectares of that primary forest, had about 1.7 billion left, but we've regenerated some in New England and partly Europe. So we've got about 3.5 billion hectares of forest, and we've still got about 5 billion hectares of grassland. And so cattle are herbivores are absolutely fundamental in synergy, symbiosis with these grasslands in maintaining productive grasslands, both in eating them so they don't become fires, but also in biofertilizing and building the soil carbon, right? So grasslands are relatively, very sophisticated, relatively newly evolved system, but absolutely intimately connected with their herbivores. So we need those herbivores, and obviously we need carnivores to eat those herbivores, because otherwise we get overgrazing and the whole system crashes, right? So now the question is, you don't have, I mean, you can be a vegan, that's cool, but the point is that we need carnivores, right? So either it's wolves, lions, or whatever, or it's diseases, right? So take your pick. We need something to manage those herbivores, right? Now, there's enough herbivores managed ecologically through grazing ecologies, elegantly, humanely, that can give us, the 10 billion people, the 100 grams of protein per person per day. Okay? So, yep, we earn that capability. If it goes to 20 billion people, leave the planet, but because we won't have enough protein anyway. But the point is, we're not going to get to 20 people. I mean, nature will close the ranks on that beforehand. But there's a more important point, you see, and this comes back to what we raised before, the nutritional integrity of the food. Because our food now has a third or less of the nutrient concentration as it did before the Second World War, because we've compromised it completely in how plants take up nutrients. And this is a bit not complicated, it's pretty simple in a way, but it's profound. So we have basically nature, and we have industrial hydroponics. And since the Second World War, of course, we've invested very much into industrial hydroponics, right? And so there we have root systems. Roots were blue. We have root systems, and of course here we have soil particles, right? And they've got charges on them, negative charges, and that's of course where all your selenium and your calcium and your magnesium and your manganese, all these essential trace elements live. And of course in the soil solution, you know, the water around them, you've got also soluble ions, and of course, yeah, there's your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your sulfates, okay, and of course also your sodium, your aluminium, your cadmium, if you've got acid conditions, right? And basically our industrial hydroponic groups have been designed and selected and enhanced and bred to operate by actually taking nutrients from this soil solution effectively as if they were straws, right? So you're more or less saying, look, here is a straw, and this plant is getting nutrient water up there through its transpiration stream, and is just taking basically what's in the soil solution, all the green stuff, and taking that up into the plant. But because it's just taking the soluble nutrients, it's not getting enough of these trace elements, the 50 plus essential trace elements, often in parts per billion quantities, because they're fused onto these soil surfaces through ionic charges, right? So you end up with supersaturation NPK, you often end up with toxic levels of salt or aluminium if it's acid, and very, very low trace elements. And that's in a sense the basis of, basically the UK Health Ministry making that data. Our food, our carrots now have less than a third and often zero of these essential red ones, right? And that lack of nutritional and compromising on nutritional integrity is totally associated with the exponential rise in diet-related diseases in our industrial populations in the last 50 years. You know, diabetes, your cancers, your, like all those diet-related diseases, grown exponentially 6 to 8% in direct association. I mean, we can prove individual disease things, but at the broad spectrum, it's an association with this lack of nutritional integrity in our food. And that's actually costing us about 3 times what our food costs us now in terms of disease impacts on society. Nature, of course, doesn't do this. It's not that clever. It's too clever, actually. And it doesn't actually operate through that system at all. It still has, of course, the same soil particles. And, of course, those soil particles have the same trace elements on them. But basically, nature works through a different process of nutrient uptake entirely, because they have symbiotic fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, that proliferate throughout the soil and grow over all these mineral surfaces. I was a junior microbiologist, researched 25,000 kilometres of fungal hyphae per cubic metre of healthy soil. Twice the diameter of the Earth, each cubic metre of fungal hyphae proliferating throughout these soils, right? I had a little ruler to measure them, but no, better, smarter techniques than that. But the point is, these are critically important. And they don't even take up the nutrients from these surfaces in this way, but they intelligently, selectively absorb those nutrients. So let's draw, they're green, let's draw a fungal hyphae. Now we've blown this up, big microscope. So it has 2 phospholipid membranes. These have ion channels across them, right? This is actually quite sophisticated biophysiology. And basically these are growing on a soil particle. So we'll just draw a little soil particle here. And they are actually directly putting out organic acids, solubilizing the nutrients, transporting them across these ion channels and taking these nutrients through their hyphae. And we've done the experiment. This is CSIRO work, all published and stuff like that. And basically, they are selectively intelligently. So if zinc is an essential nutrient, if we put this mycorrhiza in a low zinc soil, it will concentrate zinc and take up 180% of the controls. If we put it in a high zinc soil, where zinc is starting to get toxic, it will basically selectively exclude and take up 70% of the control. Okay, so we have, in a sense, a selective, intelligent membrane interface in these natural systems, which are actually, re-regulating the nutritional concentration that the hyphae get, the plant get. The right forms, concentration, ratio and balances of the 50-odd nutrients that we've evolved with and depend on fundamentally for our biochemistry. Linus Pauling, 70 years ago, all the biochemistry work, 90% of human preventative health directly relates to the nutritional integrity. Have we got all the nutrients we need for our enzyme physiology? Right, so that's in a sense how nature drives its nutrition. It's fundamentally different from that. Coming back to your point, so grass-fed beef growing on natural pastures is taking up its nutrient there. Therefore, the fungi taking up those nutrients, the beef has these and it has this nutritional integrity. Grey goo, by contrast, must be in that situation, right? Okay, because the plants, the soybeans, the maize, genetically engineered, they already have that, right? And they've got genetic biochemicals on top of that. Sorry.
Isn't that also your answer to the agrochemical approach to agriculture? Because if I'm understanding correctly, it's not just hydroponics in the way people understand it as rooms full of things with dripping water.
Yeah.
That's an agrochemical field.
Yes.
Laid bare and planted in chemical.
Totally. Now, nothing wrong with if, like in Australia, we've got some very, very old leach soils with basically bug or copper in them, so we add some copper trace elements because they get incorporated into this system. But yeah, the idea that we don't even know what the optimum micronutrient balance is for human health. Okay? So the fact is that, yeah, we've got two contrasting things. This is only 70 years old, only since the Second World War. We evolved in this system until then. All our nutrition, all our food, all our health was governed by this. We've taken a big experiment into hydroponics, into that stuff. So, look, that explains... Okay, so, yeah, another question? Go for it.
Would you even take it further? So the evolutionary arguments around how we evolved, diets we evolved, for example, the paleoarchaeological record of our cranial development.
Yes, of course. No, of course. We need lipids, and then our brains couldn't have... Yeah.
There's a, as I understand it, there's a great difference between nutrient density and bioavailability.
Yes.
Not all produce that we grow is created equal.
Absolutely.
Our ability to assimilate those nutrients
Absolutely.
have been made available.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, we're not necessarily co-evolved. For example, annual crops, for the most part, are wayside plants that we've taken over a relatively short period of our history and sort of bred the toxicity out of them.
Yes.
But we know that a small percentage of the population are very allergic to.
Yes, look, there's all those reactions, and then the amount, as you said, and the amount of spinach we have to eat to get the same iron as we need from meat, it's a different thing. But the gentleman of the show.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, around concerning the figure around the 100 times.
Methane photooxidation.
Is there any evidence you could direct me to, any kind of studies that show that?
Okay, that figure of 100 is yes. No. Look, let's be honest. Yes, it's our calculations. From what sort of area does a cow equivalent maintain? What's the transpiration? But no, look, it would vary enormously, right? Because it depends on how long it's green, how much moisture. So I wouldn't. I mean, there is that multiplier, but nailing it to 100 as an absolute figure, I wouldn't be doing that. No. Quickly.
It seems that you're talking to the converted here mostly.
Yeah.
And so the question was, how do you change the outside? So how do we turn farmers into heroes?
They are heroes already. Hey, farmers are heroes, right?
We think they are.
Okay. No, look, big question, deserves enormous discussion. How do we catalyse this change? Yes, it's all about information, documenting the evidence, presenting the evidence, talking to key stakeholders, talking to key influencers, multipliers, including finance sectors. Enormous, and this is where actually we should have a longer discussion, Edmund, Christopher. See, this is where we're at. How do we... There's no dispute about the science. Quite frankly, I've been here for 10 years. Nobody's thrown eggs at me or tomatoes or whatever, you see, because, the Stefan Boltzmann equation, the photooxidation, they all know that's true. That's it. There's no argument about it. But the point is, it's context. I give the farmers this advice: buy more fertilizers. Your grain prices will cover it, but they're not telling you that. They're only giving you a very narrow, biased window into that story.
But they don't know that. The fertilizer salespeople don't know any of that.
Well, hang on. No, they do know. I remember asking the question in 1964. Say, hey, this is bullshit because the science. Okay, but we've had a perpetuation of misinformation. Of course we have. Yeah, and of course all the plant physiology. This is where I was arguing with them. Plant physiologists. They did all the nutrient uptake studies of different mines on excised roots, basically roots in tanks, etc., because otherwise they couldn't control for things, you see, and of course it's just an artificial construct, So
Walter, I'm not watching.
No, time. Look, 10,